First of all, a big thank you to NISO for organizing this virtual conference and to my fellow presenters and attendees. My talk today focuses on the affordances that accessible, ubiquitous technologies have for researchers. And of course, this is an especially timely topic as we find ourselves having the privilege of still being able to meet today because we're connecting remotely, even though we're in the midst of what is a global pandemic. To give you a sense of where I'm coming from, I am in the heart of the pandemic right now. I am based in New York City, and I have not left my apartment more than for a brief few minutes in the last 2 weeks already. So I have the privilege of coming to this topic because of the work that I do with Ithaca S&R. Jill, just to give you, unfortunately, my slides have now stuck.
Oh, okay, no. It's all right. We're not panicking here.
Got it.
There we go. There you go.
I'm a very impatient person by nature, so this may happen 5 more times.
You're fine.
So these quote unquote kinds of technical affordances that I have just been lauding and now cursing are the kinds of things that also have great impacts on the research community. And it's an issue that I am privileged to have a bird's eye view into because of my background as an applied social science researcher who effectively studies scholars. So Ithaca S&R is a not-for-profit research organization. We focus on issues pertaining to access to information and technology in higher education. And I head up a program for S&R that's called Research Support Services, where we have actually been examining the practices and support needs of scholars by discipline or thematic area for quite a while now. We've done a series of studies, discipline by discipline, qualitatively, and here I have listed the broad array of fields where we have done deep dives into scholars' research practices, focusing on their information activities, including how they're facilitated through technology. Ithaca, of course, also has a triennial faculty of survey of faculty in the US. So we also get to see how changes are affecting folks over time as they do their research. However, we are in the midst of a pandemic, and I actually realized after I'd already designed my talk that it would be important to focus on what we're facing right now. So I want to begin by acknowledging that actually technology on its own cannot keep research going. This may sound simplistic as a statement at its face, but it's something that we are being confronted with in real time, any of us who are doing research support for scholars. So much of the current research enterprise has been halted due to the pandemic, which throws into relief how dependent we are, not just on the technologies we use, but the face-to-face aspect of research, being on site or in the field, and that there are these great advances we've made, but it's ultimately not a panacea to rely on technology, particularly at a point when we have so much disruption. So here, is one among many examples one could draw about the kinds of challenges that researchers are facing, some of which can be ameliorated by technologies and some of which cannot. So Helen Davies, who is a humanist, says, PhD during Corona, the library's closed, fine, they let me take my books home first. B, but they closed the lab, not fine. C, my advisor is trapped in another country and can't get home if she wanted to. And D, my advisor is now trapped in another country without Wi-Fi. Can I quit yet? And this really sums up the edge that I'm exploring today in my talk, the edge of what is possible and not possible, despite many of the affordances of the accessible and ubiquitous technologies we rely on today. We know this firsthand. There are factors that many of us are facing that could make it challenging for us to even participate in this virtual conference today, despite our capacity for remote connectivity. We have new work that we're doing while we're trying to transition what we do day to day online. Some of us are caring for children or other dependents. And of course, there's all of the anxiety that comes with great uncertainty, things that are deceptively simple around connectivity, such as Wi-Fi. We're dealing with all of this in real time. So in some instances, the disruption of COVID-19 has highlighted the successes that have been made in making research-related materials, tools, and services available to researchers remotely, particularly in the sphere of libraries, and to a lesser extent, archives and special collections, as well as the pre-existing data sets and the way that many of the things we do in terms of publishing are done through remotely at this point. And I divided it up by what researchers can do and what researchers cannot do. Of course, there's a lot of things we can do around literature reviews. Some of us are still relying on books that were physical and may or may not have been able to get them, but a lot of it can be done online. You can consult some digitized primary sources if you're a humanist. You can analyze pre-existing data sets, and many in STEM and social science fields are working with pre-existing data sets. You can review or organize materials such as your lab notebooks if you have kind of a rainy day activity. You can connect remotely with your collaborators and peers as long as they're not stuck in a country with poor Wi-Fi or in a geographic area within a country with poor Wi-Fi. And then there are, of course, still opportunities to share data and findings. But as you can see in the category of what researchers cannot do, the limits are especially felt in the realm of data collection. Note that this also applies to data collection that could be done remotely. So even those who theoretically can do online surveys or conduct interviews online, it's obviously not the ideal time to do a lot of this research. People are under considerable stress, and for many, the best practice is going to be to halt their data collection. Then we have the other aspects of doing this work, even things that many of us would take for granted around keeping your mice alive or your bacteria cultures going. A lot of this work has been disrupted, and for the majority of researchers. Technology is also an important enabler for the pressing research that is being done on COVID-19, and not just because the resources and capacity are being commandeered on a mass scale to work around or to work on these problems. I would say that it's also these accessible, ubiquitous technologies that we use day to day that is also a strong enabler of the research that is being done on COVID-19 right now, particularly in the way that it can facilitate the sharing of data. I have here the example of an organization I still don't know how to pronounce out loud yet. It may be GISAID or it could be GISAID. Maybe somebody can share in the comments how this is supposed to be pronounced. And the goal of this entity is to facilitate the sharing of virus genetics. This is a research community that is at the heart of the efforts to understand the virus. It's one of the bigger news stories right now about how researchers are coming together to work on this grand problem. So what it is at its heart is a platform for sharing genomic data was tailor-made by influenza scientists. It was created back in 2008, and it was actually a response to what had happened around the bird flu epidemic, H1N1, in 2006. After that epidemic, there was a call from the scientific research community to do a better job of sharing their data. And so this platform was created and now is considered an essential mechanism for sharing influenza genetic sequencing and metadata. And it's used by influenza researchers, which are an interdisciplinary community that includes public health and animal health scientists, as well as governments and those working for governments around the world. It's administered through a public-private partnership. There's an administrative arm of it, and then there's collaboration among several governments to keep it going. So the example of this data community is really powerful because it shows us what is still possible with the technologies we already have. It's not necessarily something that involved a very new, rare kind of technology. It's a platform that is really at its heart a community-driven effort using what is actually quite accessible to a lot of researchers to make their data available. So what makes data sharing work? This involves a fundamentally social activity. We have done research on a variety of fields and have been demonstrated again and again that when we think about data sharing and the power of it, it at its heart is a goal by a community to do this work, not just the technology alone. We have looked into a variety of success stories at Ithaca SNR, including the Cambridge Structural Database, Flybase, and Design Safe CI. And this research is already published, so I'm not going to go into further detail about it today, but encourage you to check it out on our website. And at the heart of it, and at the heart of what I shared about the COVID-19 data community, is that a data community is a fluid and informal network of researchers who share and use a certain type of data. It's not quite a repository, although it's usually involves a repository, and it's being used by people that are not in a discipline, but rather it's an informal group of people who are focused on a single type of data and a common cause. So returning back to the example of the COVID-19 data community, the users of that platform comprise a variety of research subfields: epidemiology, human and veterinary virology, bioinformatics, and there's audiences within and outside academia who are using it concurrently. So it's not just one core group of researchers, but actually spans to other applied usages beyond the academy. When we looked into how data communities worked and what make them successful, what we identified were some common characteristics. And first and foremost is bottom-up development. So it's not so much a situation of build it and they will come. Instead, the way this works is that you start with a fully developed you don't start with a fully developed infrastructure and hope to just attract researchers along the way. Instead, the projects start with groups of researchers who then develop a better infrastructure over time, gradually, to meet their needs. So the COVID data community example is classic in this respect. It started 18 months after a call was published in Nature by 77 scientists. Really having a desire to start a data sharing initiative. It didn't come from any one government or some sort of granting agency, for example. Secondly is the importance of making sure that the data sharing can happen in ways that are respective of community norms. So you want to make sure that this actually is consistent with how researchers want to do their work and what is needed in this area. So with GIS aid, it was built in with the recognition that that community needed a sharing mechanism that was better than the pre-existing public domain archives that were out there. They needed the access to the data and the depositing to not take place anonymously. The platform enables sharing while still protecting intellectual property rights, which was seen as really needed here. And it's the kind of thing that was not only valuable to individual scientists, but also to countries that had been hesitant in the past to share their information through other public domain archives, such as EMBL or DDBJ or GenBank. Finally, is the absence of or mitigation of technical barriers. And what we mean here is that when we look at data sharing success stories, they are in fields where the data by its nature is actually easier to share and reuse is standardized in a large scale way. There can be success in sharing data that is more difficult to reuse, but it takes a lot more work to mitigate those barriers. And GIS aid is an example of a field where the data was already relatively easy to share, and it was not as challenging as other fields to set up a platform, which is why it is particularly relevant to the theme of today's conference. In contrast, there are other areas of research activity where the concept of data sharing is much more complicated. I share here an example of those working with archival collections, where the use of accessible ubiquitous technologies have been able to improve some areas of the researcher's workflow, but not all of them. So when I originally was going to give this talk, I actually had this framed entirely around a success story, because what's going on in the archive world today with researchers is really, really exciting. There's the problem that digitizing primary source collections is actually really hard for many archives and special collections to do, due to the realities of access policies and research allocation. So what many scholars find themselves in is a situation where they themselves still have to travel to physical archival collections to do their research to analyze primary sources. That being said, a lot of scholars are working in a really exciting way with accessible ubiquitous technologies to do their work. What they're doing in essence is they are taking pictures of content in archives. They can do this relatively easily now. Cell phone cameras, scanner apps make all of this possible, as well as relatively cheap storage that can be done in the cloud. However, the the situation we find ourselves right in has made me think of this example in a somewhat different way. So while these ways of capturing content in an archive makes the work of researchers easier in some respects, it isn't a perfect solution, particularly at a time when people cannot travel to archives themselves to do that quick collection work. So when we're not all restricted from traveling and in a regular situation, we see scholars creating thousands of digital surrogates of primary sources now by leveraging their cell phones and associated apps. Um, for example, there is the Sorcery app, which has been created now. It's a really exciting new tool where researchers will actually be able to request that others go and take pictures of content in the archives for them for a fee. It's kind of like the Uber of the archives world. But this all falls apart when people can't visit these institutions anymore to do their research in a situation like now. Similarly, after a scholar has had these images collected for them or they collected themselves, the real affordance comes with the amount of work they can do off-site. They can spend a lot less time in an archive if they're taking pictures. With the analysis, they can do their analysis at home and they can store and organize their images fairly easily. We find through our research that most are still doing this through bespoke systems for organizing and analyzing their data, but there is also a really great tool called Tropy that enables scholars to do this. And I apologize if anybody can hear the great noise in the background that I'm experiencing right now from many car alarms. So then we have cheap cloud storage that is also enabling scholars to store these kinds of images for their personal use. However, during this pandemic, what also seems important to reflect on is the fact that this workflow still halts at the stage of sharing out what is being collected by individual researchers. If people cannot travel to archives, which is the position that most find themselves in right now, it is also reasonable to anticipate that travel will continue to be disrupted beyond the short term due to economic and public health necessities, as well as environmental considerations. And one wonders if there's some way that we could actually be leveraging what people have already been collecting themselves, because we can see through studies such as Ian Milligan's recent survey of historians in Canada that more than half of the profession now is actually collecting thousands of these images. So some of the barriers to sharing what I call primary source digital surrogates is that it goes back to this idea that technology alone can't be the answer. We actually do have a lot of the technological affordances that would be necessary to get scholars to share these images that they're taking themselves. And I would say that it is more pressing than ever that we come up with these kinds of solutions to maximize the opportunities for sharing this kind of content. Um, the barriers right now are mostly social, and they fall into the category of community norms. First and foremost is that primary sources are not even perceived as data. The pre-existing culture of scholars who work with them do not see this themselves as a form of data collection, and their work is not oriented around sharing with others, to, both for their own work and for their reward systems. Secondly, primary sources often contain individually or culturally sensitive information. So what can and cannot be shared is not in the exclusive purview of the researcher. And some of the most exciting work that's being done around how primary source and other cultural heritage information is shared is thinking through first and foremost what will not be shared by others, as opposed to just maximizing sharing in and of itself. And for that, I point to Mercadoo, which is a really great platform that is used with Indigenous cultural heritage, where the premise isn't just let's share everything, but rather what needs to be kept for the communities, what is sacred to them. And then finally, it's unclear whether primary source digital surrogates can be of sufficient value to collecting institutions. So it's not just about what the researchers want to do and what they need, but ideally one would come up with some sort of solution where the images that scholars are taking of these collections would also be fed back to archives and special collections. But because archives and special collections have their own norms, for example, not just thinking about researchers' need today, but thinking about preservation and future use, the priority of sharing this kind of content gets pushed down quite a bit. So what does this all mean for us today? And when we're thinking also of the medium and the longer term, I think that the pandemic does highlight that while there are affordances of ubiquitous technologies to how many researchers are doing the work, these affordances are ultimately uneven. There are a number of gaps in researcher workflows, and a lot of them hit on data collection. When we think about how data collection challenges can be overcome, data sharing is one great way to do that. And there's a lot of technological affordances that are set up to help researchers to be able to do this. However, not every research community is set up to have benefits from this. One way forward when thinking about how we could help certain research communities that may be in a position to share more of their data would be to identify and support emergent data communities. Those would be groups that there is some interest in sharing their data, but they're in a nascent phase of being able to do so themselves. So at Ithaca SNR, we are very interested in this kind of work. We have a number of upcoming research projects that we're going to be doing that hit on different aspects of this topic. We will be doing a large-scale study of scholars who work with big data, for example, and we're doing that in partnership with 21 academic libraries in the US. With that project, each school will be assembling a research team to talk to scholars that work with big data at their institution. And they'll be producing individual reports about what they've learned. And Ithaca will also be doing a meta-analysis and creating a report on the findings across the schools. And just as an aside, we find ourselves on that project in a similar position to many of the researchers that I was talking about today. Certain parts of our project will be able to still proceed unimpeded, and then other aspects have to be rethought. Just the other day, we analyzed all of the IRBs and their response to COVID to see whether or not the regulations had changed around even submitting protocols. The big changing that we observed so far was that going forward at most institutions, there will there seems to be an expectation that you will be able to speak to how your data collection could be done remotely, which thankfully for our projects that's possible, but it's something that is every researcher is going to have to think through. We're also going to be doing additional work on thinking about how you actually identify emergent data communities and begin to work with them. We're hoping to pilot a method for identifying, supporting them with a group of interested information professionals, and welcome expressions of interest for anybody who thinks that's the kind of project they'd want to be involved with. For those who are interested in learning more about emergent data communities, we've done a series of spotlights on our blog, and we also have an issue brief on data communities, how they work, particularly in STEM fields. So that's the conclusion of my presentation today. I wanted to make sure to give a few minutes for questions, and I thank you for following along with me so far.
Thank you, Danielle. You've done a lovely job. There was a question that came in very quickly after you'd started. Um, One of our attendees is asking, is your research focused on US scholarship only, or are you looking at the research communities at a global level?
So that's a great question. So when it comes to a number of the projects we've done in the past that are on disciplinary fields, those have for the most part been US centric. But when we start looking into specific data communities, which of course are not discipline specific, but in fact cut across disciplines, this is where the focus becomes international. So when I'm talking about things like GIS aid or GIS aid or however it is pronounced, that is a completely international endeavor. In fact, it's, I think, a very impressive example of international coordination. Once again, it's a public-private partnership, and so there's an administrative branch that runs like a not-for-profit, but then there are several governments that are collaborating on keeping it going, including Germany, Singapore, and the US. So I think that's also something that's really powerful around the narrative of data sharing is that, and data communities. Many data communities are able to leverage what is actually, you know, relatively unsophisticated technology by our standards at this point to be able to share data across geographic lines.
Another question from one of our participants today. What different evolutions do you see in research versus clinical research data sharing?
I'm not sure I'm capable of answering that question. I feel like somebody who's in the clinical, when the way that we do our research is from a really, like, it's the bird's eye view. So I wouldn't be able to speak in such depth about how clinical data research in general has evolved. Um, we haven't done a project that's quite on that topic yet, but now I want to do one.
It does seem like it would be a particularly interesting area to investigate. Another question. What roles do you think the libraries can take in terms of facilitating research or data collection, sharing, and community?
This is, to me, the question that I think is just so important. To give you some background, I am a librarian of myself, and all of the research projects that I shared about involve collaborating with librarians as researchers. I think there's a variety of ways that libraries can be involved with this work. Um, I point, for example, to like the incredible work of the Data Curation Network, which is a group of different institutions and their librarians that have come together to help facilitate the curation of data. You know, there's sharing in the moment, and then there's questions about how this data, what data should be kept and preserved, and how people can use it over time. And that's an example of a really incredible model to do that work. Just today, the Research Data Alliance, alongside Go Fair and CoData, have announced a working group around standards for data sharing, and they're focusing specifically on public health related data, and the coordination efforts that are going on globally. So, what this means in its essence is that I've given two examples where there's a lot of work that can be done even at an institutional or cross institutional level to serve researchers and how they share data day to day, but also there are these ways that information professionals can get involved at a very collaborative scale globally, even. And I think that the skills that we have as professionals around understanding how people do their work, the metadata needs there, the technical standards, the fact that we are connected to researchers on the ground, being that kind of bridge is incredibly valuable.
Okay. Well, Danielle, thank you very much for that excellent presentation.